Putin recently did a speech in Algeria in which he talked about the crimes that were committed by Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War.
If we look at the heroes, they refer to heroes of Ukraine. See, there are neo-Nazis, followers of Hitler. These gangs of neo-Nazis, they attacked over 70 villages, and their cruelty and sadistic approaches remain shocking. So women were stabbed, and they hammered babies. And in one of the villages, the Goshkevich brothers, who were trying to inform partisans, they were gutted, and this was really terrible. And in 1943, 1944, the Bandera army killed from 80 to 100 Polish citizens, and only when the Russian army came here, so they were punished and removed from this area. So we have shown you who was Stepan Bandera and his associates, and they claim that he is a hero of Ukraine. So this is the person who has been protected by the Ukrainian government, and they follow and protect this ideology. We cannot but fight this ideology. Russia suffered greatly in the Second World War, and our losses were the biggest among all countries.
And he stated, look to Ukraine's historical heroes, and you will find Nazi collaborators and people who committed war crimes. And he brought up some of these war crimes. He brought up the massacre of the Polish people in regions such as Volhynia and East Galicia, where Ukrainian nationalists murdered around 100,000 Polish people in the 1940s. Putin brought up these crimes. And yet people would listen to Putin's speech, and they will say things like, oh, there's Putler. They call him Putler because, he's Hitler. They'll say, oh, there's Putler spreading Russian propaganda. And if you say things similar to what Putin said, if you talk about the things that Putin talked about in this speech, if you bring up the Nazism that lies within the Ukrainian government or within the Ukrainian armed forces, there are people who will quickly accuse you of spreading Russian propaganda, of being a Putin bot, of being a Putlerist or whatever. But the reality is that between the conflict breaking out in Ukraine in 2014 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the mainstream media was very vocal about Ukraine's Nazi problem. Oh yes, for years, if you look at the years between the conflict breaking out in 2014 and the war breaking out in 2022, you will find a huge number of articles from mainstream media outlets about Ukraine's Nazism, about the fascism that lies within Ukrainian society. But after the war, things began to change. And they began to talk about how the Azov battalion was reformed. Because when the conflict broke out in 2014, the main military unit, the main fighting unit fighting against the pro-Russian separatists in Donbass, in places like Mariupol, was the Azov battalion, a neo-Nazi paramilitary organization which was eventually embedded into the Ukrainian armed forces. But even after it was embedded into the Ukrainian armed forces, the mainstream media was still talking about how it was a neo-Nazi paramilitary group. But then after Putin invaded Ukraine, the terminology and the tone began to change in the articles published by mainstream media outlets. They began to say, oh, well, Azov Battalion was reformed. It was denazified. But they weren't saying that in 2020. In fact, as late as November of 2020, The Guardian was calling Azov a neo-Nazi extremist movement. In 2018, The Guardian published an article titled "Neo-Nazi Groups Recruit Britons to Fight in Ukraine," in which the Azov Battalion was called, quote, "a notorious Ukrainian fascist militia." But by February of 2023, The Guardian, the same newspaper, was assuring readers that Azov's fighters, quote, "are now leading the defense of Mariupol, insisting they have shed their previous dubious politics and rapidly becoming Ukrainian heroes." And what happened eventually in the Azov Battalion was the leadership changed. It went from being under its founder, Andrei Beletsky, to being ran by Denis Prokopenko. Andrei Beletsky was an open Nazi. He stated very clearly that he wanted to lead a race war. He believed in a cause against the Semitic religions, which would be obviously Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So these people are anti-Christian. And he was obviously a Nazi. It was obvious. But then the leadership changed, and the Azov Battalion went from being under Beletsky to being under Prokopenko. Denis Prokopenko was being presented on CNN. And I remember CNN saying, "Oh, here's a video from an Azov fighter, from an Azov commander telling us what's going on the ground." And they played a video of Denis Prokopenko talking.
Now, CNN has spoken with a commander, a Ukrainian military commander, who's been defending the city from the siege. Take a listen to what he sent us a day ago.
People are cooking food in the streets, risking their lives under the continuing shellings and bombing, and the temperature is minus 5 degrees Celsius in the street.
And it's like, CNN showing a Nazi on their news network? Well, he's not really a Nazi. That's just Russian propaganda, because you see, Azov got reformed. Azov got denazified. But then you find out that Mr. Prokopenko was a member of a neo-Nazi soccer club. He was a member of a neo-Nazi football hooligans club called the White Boys Club. This is a known neo-Nazi football gang. And there are many of these all throughout Europe. And Prokopenko was a part of that. So Prokopenko is a Nazi, and he's leading Azov. And for years, the media was telling us that Azov was Nazi, it was extremist, it was white supremacist, it was, they want to lead a race war. But now they're saying otherwise. Now they're saying, well, they've changed and they're not that bad anymore. And, well, the Russians are accusing them of being Nazis, but that's just Russian propaganda. And for how many years has the media been talking about the far right? They keep talking about this. You go on the BBC, you go on The Guardian, whatever. The far right this, the far right that, right? The far right in America, the far right in England, the far right in Ireland, the far right in Germany, the far right in Denmark, the far right in Sweden, the far right in China, the far right in Japan, far right in Greece. But once Russia invaded Ukraine, what happened to the far right? What happened to the far right in Ukraine? They toned down a lot of their language after the Russians invaded Ukraine. Why? Because the Azov Battalion is a NATO proxy against Russia. It really is as simple as that. And what's interesting is that the BBC had been among the first to warn the world about the Azov Battalion. It was amongst the first media outlets to report about the neo-Nazi battalion called Azov. The BBC even criticized Kiev in 2014 for ignoring a group that, quote, sports 3 Nazi symbols on its insignia. A 2018 report from the BBC also noted Azov's, quote, well-established links to the far right.
The National Militia are part of a group called Azov. Initially a volunteer military battalion, it has well-established links to the far right.
So here they are, right? Azov was well-established. It was part of this big network of the far right. But now they're heroes. Now they're fighting against the evil Russians. Here's their commander to talk to us. Here's their commander to give us a message on the ground for CNN. And people wonder, how is fascism going to revive? How is fascism going to come back from the dead. How would that look like? You're seeing it right here. All you need is some major event like Russia invading another country, Russia invading Ukraine, and all of a sudden, Nazis fighting the Russians are the good guys. What you are seeing is a presaging sign. It's a sign that foreshadows how fascism will become in the future more and more tolerated. It will be tolerated under the pretext of fighting against some greater enemy. In this case, it's Russia. Here is an article from the BBC published in December of 2014, just to give you guys the difference here between now and then. This is what the BBC said in 2014. The ultra-nationalists have proven to be effective and dedicated fighters in the brutal war in the East against Russian-backed separatists and Russian forces, whose numbers also include a large contingent from Russia's far right. The volunteer Azov Battalion is a case in point. Run by the extremist Patriot of Ukraine organization, which considers Jews and other minorities subhuman and calls for a white Christian crusade against them, it sports 3 Nazi symbols on its insignia: a modified wolf's hook, a black sun, Hakensonne, and the title Black Corps, which was used by the Waffen SS. So here's an article from the BBC after Russia's invasion. Instead of celebrating the overthrow of Ukraine's government, the Kremlin will have to settle for the capture of most of Mariupol. The city may lie in ruins, but Russia has repeatedly talked of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, and it may claim defeat of the Azov Battalion, which it has falsely portrayed as Nazi. So in 2014, well, they have Nazi symbols. It's run by this extremist organization called Patriot of Ukraine, and they consider Jews and other minorities to be Untermenschen, to be subhuman. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, that's false. That's all nonsense. And if you bring up Ukraine's Nazism, well, you're spreading Russian propaganda. So are you telling me that for years, major media publications like the BBC and The Guardian were falling for Russian propaganda? And there was an article that was published by The Nation about this very phenomena, the phenomena of the media changing its tone about Azov Battalion from before Russia's invasion and after Russia's invasion. And this is what the article says, quote, "Take the notion that Azov was de-radicalized after joining the National Guard in November 2014. This ignores the fact that Western outlets routinely documented Azov's neo-Nazism over the next 7 years through 2021. Whatever reformative influence Kiev had to offer clearly didn't work. Azov continued to recruit white supremacists, and in 2016, it was accused by human rights groups of committing war crimes, the only difference being that after 2014, it did so as part of a NATO-trained force. And that's why the tone has changed. That's why the language has changed, because it's a NATO-backed proxy. It really is that simple. It's not about principles. It's not about morals. It's not about fighting fascism. It's about what is advantageous to the American empire. It really is that simple. People will bring up the Nazi symbols used by Azov Battalion. People will bring up the Nazi patches. People will bring up the Nazi imagery used by the Azov Battalion. And they'll say, well, yeah, but you know, those are just images. They're part of European culture. I've heard that nonsense before. Part of European culture. It's not a big deal. Some rock bands use it, so it's cool. Who cares? If it's so innocent and so harmless, then tell me, why in the hell did the Ukrainian government and NATO post photos of Azov fighters with Nazi insignia and then deleted those photos if it's so innocent? Here's a quote from the article published last week by the New York Times. It says, "Since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine last year, the Ukrainian government and NATO allies have posted, then quietly deleted, 3 seemingly innocuous photographs from their social media feeds: a soldier standing in a group, another resting in a trench, and an emergency worker posing in front of a truck. In each photograph, Ukrainians in uniform wore patches featuring symbols that were made notorious by Nazi Germany and have since become part of the iconography of far-right hate groups. The photographs and their deletions highlight the Ukrainian military's complicated relationship with Nazi imagery, a relationship forged under both Soviet and German occupation during World War II. So if it's all so innocent, then why delete the photos after publishing them? Because you know damn well that they're Nazis. And if you talk enough about the Nazi problem in Ukraine, the Nazi phenomena in Ukraine, then you get accused of falling for Russian propaganda. Well, tell me, all of these major media outlets for all of these years, were they falling for Russian propaganda? You guys just heard some theology. God bless.